प्रोग्राम मुद्दा लैके हाजिर हाँ। पहले भाग दे विच असीं गल कीती सी कि किवें असीं अपने इतिहास नूं भुल्लिया होया है। गदरी बाबिਆਂ ਦੀ देन नूं ਉਹ गदरी बाबे ਜਿਹੜੇ ਭਾਰਤ ਤੋਂ अमेरिका विच आए, कनेडा ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਵੀ, ਔਰ ਇਹਦੇ ਬਾਰੇ ਅਸੀਂ ਆਪਣੇ ਪਿਛਲੇ ਹਿੱਸੇ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਗੱਲ ਕੀਤੀ। ਉਹਦੀ ਕੰਟੀਨਿਊਟੀ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਹੀ ਅਸੀਂ ਗੱਲ ਕਰ ਰਹੇ ਹਾਂ ਕਿ ਅਸੀਂ ਕਿਵੇਂ ਆਪਣੇ ਇਤਿਹਾਸ ਦੇ ਪੰਨਿਆਂ ਨੂੰ ਭੁੱਲਿਆ ਹੈ ਔਰ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਪੰਨਿਆਂ ਨੂੰ ਲੱਭਿਆ ਹੈ Joanna Ogden ने। Welcome back again in the show.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here.
ਅਸੀਂ ਦੁਬਾਰਾ ਇਹਨਾਂ ਨਾਲ ਗੱਲ ਸ਼ੁਰੂ ਕਰਾਂਗੇ। ਜਿਵੇਂ ਅਸੀਂ ਪਿਛਲੇ ਪ੍ਰੋਗਰਾਮ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਦੱਸਿਆ ਸੀ ਕਿ ਕਿਵੇਂ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਸਿੱਖਾਂ ਨੇ ਜਿਹੜੇ ਕੁਸ਼ਤੀ ਦੇ ਤੇ ਕਬੱਡੀ ਦੇ ਜੌਹਰ ਜਾਣਦੇ ਸੀਗੇ, ਉਹਨਾਂ ਨੇ ਇੱਥੋਂ ਦੇ ਭਾਈਚਾਰੇ ਦੇ ਨਾਲ ਗੱਲਬਾਤ ਕਰਕੇ ਇੱਥੋਂ ਦੇ ਵੱਡੇ ਜਿਹੜੇ ਨਾਮੀ ਪਹਿਲਵਾਨ ਸੀ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਨੂੰ ਹਟਾ ਕੇ ਆਪਣੀ ਪਹਿਚਾਣ ਇੱਥੋਂ ਦੇ ਭਾਈਚਾਰੇ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਅਮਰੀਕਨ ਭਾਈਚਾਰੇ 'ਚ ਬਣਾਈ। You told us in last episode the Sikh Basant Singh and Dodam Singh they defeated a very famous wrestler in Portland.
Just Dodam.
Dodam, yeah. And what you found in your research, were the Sikh or the Indian people they lived here, they were part of the American community in this city, or how your research says?
So I think in some ways they weren't, and in important ways they were not. They were both. But my research, I would argue that Indians, whether they're Sikh, Hindu, Muslims, were more a part of the community and allowed a richer life than they were in most other places that I've seen. You know, the fact that they were wrestlers, and wrestling is a very intimate sport, and you know, it included all of the community, not just the East Indian community. So the fact, you know, they were part of the political organizations that were here. You know, I'm sure they went to meetings of the Finnish Socialists, the other radical workers' organizations like the Industrial Workers of the World, so workers' organizations that, especially those, the mainstream ones, did not include non-white workers, but there was really important organizations that did, and they were definitely a part of that and welcome in there.
Okay. And as 1913, the Gadar movement meetings, first meeting was in Scottish Hall, as your book shows.
Finnish Hall.
Finnish Hall,
yes.
Scottish Finnish Hall. So what do you think when this whole part started?
The organizing for Gadar, when it started? So I think, well, the public meetings were held here in Astoria, and I think they were held here because it was a safe city. They had allies here, the Finnish Socialists being one of them, and it was a safe place to have an open gathering. And the advertisement for the gathering was they had a parade down through the middle of town welcoming Hardial. The East Indians did. They had a front page notice in the newspaper saying, inviting people to come to Hardial's speeches and build him as, and Ramchandra's, build him as open revolutionists. And so that implies to me that they weren't afraid of their surroundings, you know? And that, I think, can only be appreciated when you understand that there were riots against East Indians, big ones in 1907 in Bellingham, Washington, and just a few years before here in Oregon there was one in St. John's, Oregon, which is just outside of Portland. And several hundred white workers, but also city officials, attacked the East Indian. There were probably a couple of hundred workers there, East Indian workers in the mills. They robbed them, they attacked them at gunpoint. A few people were thrown out of the second-story windows of their homes. And the Indians of St. John's, Sohan Singh Bakna, Kanchi Ram, Harnam Singh Tundilat, who was then in Bridal Veil just up the river, they organized, they pushed back, they countered it in the courts, some of them armed themselves, but most especially what they did was to dig into trying to understand more why they were oppressed and discriminated in India and in North America both. And it was that core, those people that began that study, that was the beginning of the organizers for Gadar. And I think the reason they didn't have it in St. John's, even though they had a lot of people there and the organizers were there, was Astoria was safer. They could have a public meeting, right? So I think there's a really interesting dynamic between the two different cities about learning some really difficult lessons and coalescing as a group, but using the relative, and again, it's relative. It wasn't as if Astoria was a mecca, but compared to what was going on in the West, it was much better, and they did feel safer here, I think.
Yeah, okay. The moment they were meeting with each other and doing so many things as you explained, but my concern is at this moment, they were living a social life here, as you explained a little bit. They were wrestling. As I saw few of the things, the historical pages in the what is
Clatsop County Historical Society.
Historical, yeah. And they said they drunk and they were fined. That is a part of our culture.
Yeah.
But as I saw, one family lived with their kids and their wife.
Yes.
Most of the Indian and Sikh people, they lived alone, the singles.
Yes.
Do you remember anything who was, as Karen told us in last episode, Bakshi Singh, daughter Karthar?
Yeah.
But the other people they lived, I don't know, or either maybe you are familiar, some of them, they got married here with the American women.
There were, so they were the only family, not just in, the Dillons were the only family, not just in Astoria, but in all of Oregon. And there were very few families, and the kids went to school here in Astoria. And I think they were also a place where single men came and had a home-cooked meal and played with the children and all that. So, but they tended, Astoria had a lot of single men living here. The Finns, there were a lot of single Finnish men, and they had boarding houses. And out at Hammond Mill, where most of the East Indians lived or worked, there were barracks out there, and then there were homes that would house, say, 4 to 6 people. And that's mostly where people lived. But there were people like Basanta Singh, Dodam Singh, that they lived in the center of town and very close to actually the Chinese district, Astoria's Chinatown.
Okay.
So mostly in the barracks and the bunk houses and the individual houses associated with that out in Alderbrook, but they did also have rent places in Astoria itself, in the town.
Did you see any in your research Chinese name or a Sikh name merged, or people got confused?
Yes.
And or the conflict between Chinese or Punjabis?
I didn't read anything about conflict between the two, but I definitely read what you were talking about one of the earliest articles I found, and maybe there are other ones, but the earliest article I found in the Astoria paper about the Indian community here was a small one-paragraph notice about the death of Rama Singh.
Ram Singh.
Yeah,
you pronounced right.
Yeah.
But darshakan nu das daiye ki Ram Singh. Okay.
Yeah. But the newspaper, the first article, it was only a paragraph, and it said not much is known about him, but he died in the streets. I think he died from tuberculosis. But they spelled his last name S-I-N-G, which is an Americanized version of a Chinese last name of Singh. And Astoria had a very long history of Chinese people as a part of this community. They produced a lot of the wealth in the canneries that really again, was the source of a lot of Astoria's wealth here. And so Astoria was fairly familiar with the Chinese community. So when they heard, that's how they spelled it. And then by the second or third articles, you could tell the spelling started to change. The newspaper discovered that actually there's a whole community of workers out at Hammond from India, that Hammond Lumber Mill, that they didn't know about. And I can tell you the story about what happened with his...
with this name confusion, S-I-N-G and S-I-N-G-H.
Right.
Give me 1 second. Let me take a break.
Yeah.
And after that,
Okay.
please explain us
Okay.
what was
Okay.
the. ਆਪਣੇ ਦਰਸ਼ਕਾਂ ਨੂੰ ਦੱਸ ਦਈਏ ਕਿ ਜਿਸ ਤਰ੍ਹਾਂ ਨਾਲ ਜੋਨਾ ਨੇ ਸਾਰਾ ਐਕਸਪਲੇਨ ਕੀਤਾ ਹੈ ਕਿ ਕਨਫਿਊਜ਼ਨ ਸੀਗੀ SING ਜਿਹੜਾ ਚਾਈਨੀਜ਼ ਨੇਮ ਹੈ। ਚਾਈਨੀਜ਼ ਕਮਿਊਨਿਟੀ ਵੀ ਇੱਥੇ ਕਾਫੀ ਜ਼ਿਆਦਾ ਰਹਿੰਦੀ ਸੀ, ਪਰ ਸਿੱਖ ਕਮਿਊਨਿਟੀ ਦੇ ਨਾਲ ਭਾਵੇਂ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਦਾ ਟਕਰਾਅ ਤਾਂ ਨਹੀਂ, ਪਰ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਦੇ ਨਾਂ ਦੀ ਕਨਫਿਊਜ਼ਨ ਹੋ ਗਈ। ਉਸ ਨਾਂ ਦੀ ਕਨਫਿਊਜ਼ਨ ਦੇ ਨਾਲ ਕੀ ਸਿੱਟੇ ਨਿਕਲੇ ਇਹ ਜਾਣਦੇ ਹਾਂ ਇਸ ਬ੍ਰੇਕ ਤੋਂ ਬਾਅਦ। ਬ੍ਰੇਕ ਤੋਂ ਬਾਅਦ ਤੁਹਾਡਾ ਸਵਾਗਤ ਹੈ। ਗੱਲਬਾਤ ਕਰ ਰਹੇ ਹਾਂ ਭੁੱਲੀ ਹੋਈ ਉਸ ਹਿਸਟਰੀ ਦੀ ਜਿਹੜੀ ਗਦਰੀ ਬਾਬਿਆਂ ਨੇ ਅਸਟੋਰੀਆ ਦੀ ਸਿਟੀ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਇੱਕ ਇਤਿਹਾਸ ਸਿਰਜ ਕੇ ਰਚੀ ਸੀ। ਉਹਦੇ ਬਾਰੇ ਸਾਡੀ ਜਾਨਾ ਜਿਹੜੇ ਇੱਥੋਂ ਦੇ ਹਿਸਟੋਰੀਅਨ ਨੇ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਨਾਲ ਗੱਲਬਾਤ ਚੱਲ ਰਹੀ ਹੈ। ਜਾਨਾ, ਯੂ ਵਰ ਟੈਲਿੰਗ ਬਿਫੋਰ ਵੀ ਗੋ ਫॉर द ब्रेक, you were telling me the confusion of the name SINGH and the Chinese name. What was the story?
Well, when Rama Singh died, the paper did what was familiar to them, and they spelled his name the way a community that was familiar to the paper, the Chinese community, was spelled SING. But then you could see as you read into the paper that, having said he was an unknown person, they started discovering that there were East Indian workers in town. They corrected the spelling of his name, changed it to SING. And then there was a whole thing about other Sikhs wanted to claim his body and have a proper funeral for him. And the coroner didn't want to release the body, and so the Sikhs went to court, and the judge ruled in their favor. And it ended up that there was a whole, there's an article in the paper about a procession of some of the important people, the judges and other doctors and stuff, that accompanied the Sikhs out to the east end of town for the funeral of Rama Singh, and then a few days later lamented the fact that there was some small vandalism of the funeral pyre afterwards. But it was just a really interesting moment to see. It was like you were seeing a community, a town get familiar with a community that they hadn't been aware of before. And the pushback from the Sikhs saying, no, we have our own funerary practices. And the town finally allowing it and taking part in it on some level. So,
ਦਰਸ਼ਕਾਂ ਨੂੰ ਦੱਸ ਦਈਏ ਕਿ ਇਹੋ ਜਿਹੇ ਇਨਸੀਡੈਂਟ ਵੀ ਹੋਏ ਕਿ ਜਿਨ੍ਹਾਂ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਰਾਮ ਸਿੰਘ ਜਿਹੜੇ ਸਿੱਖ ਸੀਗੇ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਦੀ ਡੈਥ ਹੋ ਗਈ। ਜਦੋਂ ਪੇਪਰ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਆਇਆ ਤੇ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਦਾ ਨਾਂ ਚਾਈਨੀ ਨਾਂ ਦੇ ਨਾਲ ਜਿਹੜਾ ਸਿੰਘ ਸੀ SINGH ਉਹ SING ਤੱਕ ਹੀ ਪੇਪਰ ਨੇ ਲਿਖ ਦਿੱਤਾ। ਤੇ ਇੱਥੇ ਚਾਈਨੀਜ਼ ਕਿਉਂਕਿ ਕਾਫੀ ਵੱਡੀ ਗਿਣਤੀ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਇੱਥੇ ਰਹਿੰਦੇ ਸੀ, ਇਸ ਕਰਕੇ ਉਹ ਕਨਫਿਊਜ਼ਨ, ਪਰ ਕੋਰਟ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਨੇ ਬੋਡੀ ਰਿਲੀਜ਼ ਕਰਨ ਤੋਂ ਨਾ ਕਰ ਦਿੱਤੀ ਫਿਊਨਰਲ ਵਾਸਤੇ, ਔਰ ਉਹਦੇ ਲਈ ਸਿੱਖਾਂ ਨੂੰ ਕੋਰਟ 'ਚ ਜਾਣਾ ਪਿਆ। ਜਦੋਂ ਬੋਡੀ ਰਿਲੀਜ਼ ਕੀਤੀ ਗਈ ਤੇ ਉਸ ਵੇਲੇ ਜਦੋਂ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਦਾ ਫਿਊਨਰਲ ਹੋਣਾ ਸੀ, ਸੰਸਕਾਰ ਹੋਣਾ ਸੀ, ਤੇ ਸ਼ਹਿਰ ਦੇ ਬਹੁਤ ਸਾਰੇ ਲੋਕ ਜਿਹੜੇ ਨੇ ਉਸ ਫਿਊਨਰਲ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਸ਼ਾਮਲ ਹੋਏ ਤਾਂ ਕਿ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਨੂੰ ਇਹ ਪਤਾ ਲੱਗਾ ਕਿ ਸਿੱਖ ਤੇ ਚਾਈਨੀਜ਼ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਫਰਕ ਕੀ ਆ। ਇਹ ਕੁਛ ਉਹ ਕਹਾਣੀਆਂ ਨੇ ਜਿਹੜੀਆਂ ਦੱਸਦੀਆਂ ਨੇ ਕਿ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਵੇਲਿਆਂ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਸਿੱਖਾਂ ਨੂੰ ਕਿੰਨਾ ਵੱਡਾ ਜਹਾਦ ਕਰਨਾ ਪਿਆ, ਕਿੰਨੀ ਵੱਡੀ ਲੜਾਈ ਆਪਣੀ ਪਹਿਚਾਣ ਦੀ ਲੜਨੀ ਪਈ। ਐਟ ਪ੍ਰੈਜ਼ੈਂਟ ਮੂਮੈਂਟ ਇਫ ਵੀ ਆਰ ਕਮਿੰਗ ਟੂ ਨਾਓ, what you suggest, what we should do to just alive their memories
of East Indians and the memory
the
of
Sikhs,
Gadar.
especially I will say the Punjabis or Indian.
Well, I think it's hard for me to say what to do. I think that one of the things that's the challenge for all of us is that I think this history needs to be claimed by everyone. It's not just East Indians' history, it's all of our history here. And it's a part of what makes this place, it's a part of what makes us as people. And I think it holds some really important lessons for today. I think it holds lessons about, amongst the East Indian community, they put aside a lot of religious and cultural differences, whether Muslim, Hindu, or Sikh, and work together to liberate the country and come together to do that, and said, we're going to check those differences at the door. This is what we're going to do together. And I think that's an important lesson. I think it's an important lesson that even though they were maligned in the press and people attacked them, they didn't take the attitude that they had no friends. They found their allies. They looked for answers. and they had the audacity to dream about change. And I think that's a lesson that has brought, for me today, as living in this country, it feels like a very timely lesson that should be told to many people. So I think our challenge, all of us, is to make this history belong to a lot of people.
You know, one more thing. I interviewed a year before, and that news was aired on our TV channel. And after that, reinstallation of the plaque again in the park. And you saw the first time the plaque was installed, and you saw the second event about the plaque. What the difference was? Did you see that lots of people came in the second event, or it was just...
So I think it was wonderful how many people came for the second event. And I think the first event in 2013, we had much more time to plan for it. It was the 100-year commemoration. This was done in much more quickly. Terrible weather, and people still came. And for me, the most important part is it's people in the community itself taking more and more responsibility for this history and making sure it stays alive. And that's how it's going to happen. So it was wonderful. It was a wonderful day for me.
Joanna, we really appreciate and thank you so much for bringing our forgotten history to our viewers and our Sikh community and Indian community. We will get back to you again one more time, as heard that there will be annual function. So once a year, we're gonna see each other.
That would be wonderful. And I just want people to know this has enriched my life so much. It's a two-sided thing, and I'm grateful to be doing what I'm doing and with the people I'm doing it with.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. So.
ਆਪਣੇ ਦਰਸ਼ਕਾਂ ਨੂੰ ਦੱਸ ਦਈਏ ਜਾਣ ਤੋਂ ਪਹਿਲਾਂ ਕਿ ਇਹ ਇਤਿਹਾਸ ਦੇ ਉਹ ਪੰਨੇ ਨੇ ਜਿਹੜੇ ਸਮੁੰਦਰ ਦੇ ਕੰਢੇ ਦੇ ਉੱਪਰ ਅਸਟੋਰੀਆ ਸਿਟੀ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਪਏ ਹੋਏ ਸੀ। ਉਹਨਾਂ ਪੰਨਿਆਂ ਨੂੰ ਭਾਵੇਂ ਜੌਨਾ ਤੇ ਇਹਦੇ ਨਾਲ ਅਸੀਂ ਕੈਰਨ ਨੂੰ ਪਿਛਲੇ ਐਪੀਸੋਡ 'ਚ ਤੁਹਾਡੇ ਤੱਕ ਲਿਆਂਦਾ ਸੀ, ਉਹ ਲੈ ਕੇ ਆਏ ਨੇ। ਪਰ ਅਜੇ ਵੀ ਇਹਨਾਂ ਇਤਿਹਾਸ ਦੇ ਪੰਨਿਆਂ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚੋਂ ਅਸੀਂ ਆਪਣਾ ਗੁਆਚਿਆ ਵਿਰਸਾ ਤਾਂ ਲੱਭ ਰਹੇ ਹਾਂ, ਆਪਣੇ ਵੱਡੇ ਵਡੇਰਿਆਂ ਨੂੰ ਯਾਦ ਤਾਂ ਕਰ ਰਹੇ ਹਾਂ, ਪਰ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਵੱਡੇ ਵਡੇਰਿਆਂ ਦੇ ਪਰਿਵਾਰ ਦੁਨੀਆ ਭਰ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਫੈਲੇ ਹੋਏ ਨੇ। ਕਦੀ ਅਸੀਂ ਟਾਈਮ ਕੱਢਾਂਗੇ ਕਿ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਪਰਿਵਾਰਾਂ ਨੂੰ ਲੱਭੀਏ ਅਤੇ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਪਰਿਵਾਰਾਂ ਨੂੰ ਇਹ ਦੱਸੀਏ ਕਿ ਤੁਹਾਡੇ ਪੁਰਖਿਆਂ ਦੀ ਦਿੱਤੀ ਹੋਈ ਉਹ ਦੇਣ ਜਿਹਦੇ ਕਰਕੇ ਅੱਜ ਅਸੀਂ ਇਸ ਮੁਲਕ ਦੀ ਆਜ਼ਾਦੀ ਦਾ ਨਿੱਘ ਮਾਣ ਰਹੇ ਹਾਂ, ਅਤੇ ਭਾਰਤ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਵੀ ਅਤੇ ਪਾਕਿਸਤਾਨ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਵੀ ਅਸੀਂ ਉਸ ਆਜ਼ਾਦੀ ਦਾ ਨਿੱਘ ਮਾਣਿਆ ਹੈ। ਜਿਹੜੇ ਪਾਕਿਸਤਾਨੀ ਲੋਕ ਨੇ ਉਹ ਉੱਥੇ ਮਾਣ ਰਹੇ ਨੇ, ਭਾਰਤ ਦੇ ਲੋਕ ਭਾਰਤ ਵਿੱਚ ਮਾਣ ਰਹੇ ਨੇ, ਅਤੇ ਅਮਰੀਕਾ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਐਜ਼ ਵੀ ਆਰ ਸਿਟਿੰਗ ਐਜ਼ ਏ ਟੂ American and American Indian. So we are talking with each other, and as Joanna told us again and again, this history is not only Indian history, this is an American history, if I'm not wrong.
Yes.
So ਇਹਨਾਂ ਇਤਿਹਾਸ ਦੇ ਕੁਝ ਪੰਨਿਆਂ ਨੂੰ ਤੁਹਾਡੇ ਤੱਕ ਲੈ ਕੇ ਆਏ ਹਾਂ। ਆਉਂਦੇ ਸਮੇਂ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਹੋਰ ਇਹਨਾਂ ਦੇ ਬਹੁਤ ਸਾਰੇ ਪੱਖ ਨੇ ਜਿਹੜੇ ਅਸੀਂ ਤੁਹਾਡੇ ਤੱਕ ਲੈ ਕੇ ਆਵਾਂਗੇ। ਫਿਲਹਾਲ ਸਾਨੂੰ ਦਿਓ ਇਜਾਜ਼ਤ। ਤੁਹਾਡਾ ਬਹੁਤ ਬਹੁਤ ਧੰਨਵਾਦ।